Hello, dear viewers. Today is July 30th, 2025, and before you is another traditional operational situation review based on the combat operations map. Multiple changes have been recorded today, as well as fresh clarifications that affect several directions simultaneously. The most significant movements occurred on the South Donetsk, Pokrovsk, Costantineka, and Kran Leman directions. Corrections were also made to the Seusk and Oraov sectors of the front. There are also updates on the Summ direction, which we will discuss and examine visually in this video material. Before we begin, I would like to address you with a traditional request. Please subscribe to the channel. As you know, we do not collect funds or ask for donations. The only way you can support our project is through your subscription. If this is not your first time watching our reviews, but you still haven't subscribed, do it now. This will significantly help the channel's development. Thank you very much to everyone who has already supported us. And now, let's move directly to the map. Let's start with the Kherson direction. No serious changes have been noted on this front sector over the past day. According to statements from the Ukrainian side, Russian forces continue to actively use FPV drones along the entire line of contact, from southern to northern sectors. According to their information, up to 250 such unmanned vehicles are used per day. At the same time, Ukrainian forces are also striking Russian positions, both with drones and artillery. Currently, key events here are limited to airstrikes by the Russian aerospace forces and periodic combat clashes. The situation remains stable, both today and in recent months. Now let's move to the Oraov direction. Let's start with Malotokmachka, where fierce fighting continues on the eastern outskirts. There is no information about changes to the front line yet. The situation remains unclear. The Russian side claims that it managed to establish positions in this area, while Ukrainian sources say that the enemy managed to push out Russian units. The situation remains unclear for now, and we are awaiting confirmations before making changes to the map. Tension also persists in the Stepnogorsk area. Previously, there were reports of Russian forces advancing toward this settlement and occupying several high-rise buildings in the local district that had previously been subjected to FAB strikes. The Russian side claims attempts to consolidate and concentrate forces for further assault, while the Ukrainian side published videos of FPV drone strikes on concentrations of Russian military personnel. Information from both sides remains contradictory, and in the coming days, new data may emerge that will allow map corrections. Russian army progress here is estimated at up to 2.5 kilometers. In the area of the settlement of Plavny, reports came from military correspondents about the expansion of the control zone by Russian forces. Some sources color the territory on the map as being under full control of the Russian armed forces. Nevertheless, we will make corresponding changes only after confirming video materials appear. The next direction is the Tarivka area. Video confirmations came from 3 points at once, indicating that Tarivka came under Russian forces' control. Let me remind you that FAB 500s, artillery and FPV drones were actively used here earlier. The tactics remain the same: first aviation strikes, then assault. The length of the Russian armed forces' advance here was about 4 kilometers. The territory marked in red has been completely cleared and is under Russian forces' control. It's worth noting that the southern part of Tarivka represented a powerful fortified area of the armed forces of Ukraine. And now it has been completely lost by the Ukrainian side. This was reported by the Russian Ministry of Defense. Further on the map, the Novasilka area. Here the Russian army continues to expand the control zone and moves toward Kamyshevaka. Let me remind you that attacks on Kamyshevaka are also being conducted from Malivka and Shevchenko. In particular, a direct supply road leads from Shevchenko to Kamyshevaka, making the settlement particularly vulnerable. Malivka has already officially come under Russian armed forces' control. There are video materials confirming the advance, which amounted to up to 4.5 kilometers. Everything marked in red is under Russian army control. Regarding Alexandrograd, both sides report preparations for assault operations. Perhaps the assault has already begun, but given delays in information flow, this is not yet reflected on the map. Video evidence is expected to clarify the situation. The Voskresenka area. Here, the Russian armed forces advance toward the supply road leading to Andreevka Klensov. It has already been confirmed that Zelensky is under Russian forces' control. According to some reports, Russian units not only expanded the control zone west of Zelensky, but also established positions on the eastern outskirts of Andreevka Klensov. However, as in previous cases, there are currently no video confirmations, so map updates are not happening yet. The settlement of Ivanovka. According to incoming information, Russian forces forded the Vovcha River north of Zelensky and advanced toward Ivanovka. However, this is not the first case when such information appears. Previously, there were reports about river crossing near the settlement of Filia, but confirmations never followed. Therefore, we maintain previous boundaries until objective data appears. Now, Orakovo. Video materials have been received indicating that this settlement came under Russian forces' control. From Orakovo, the advance was about 1.5 kilometers. The clearing of territory north of Alexievka was also recorded, the so-called pocket, which is now completely under Russian armed forces' control. The settlement of Dakhnoye, attention, not to be confused with Udakhnoye, also appears in reports. The Russian army is expanding the control zone north of this settlement. Let me remind you that Dakhnoye is located in Dnipropetrovsk region, and this is the only settlement in the region that has come under Russian armed forces' control at the current moment. Moravka. No serious changes have been noted here. Previously, there were reports of advancement from the south from Kotlyarovka, but as of today, there are no confirmations of these reports. Udakhnoye and Kotlino also remain unchanged. That's all for now. Next, we will move to the Pokrovsk direction. Currently, the advancement of Russian units in the area of the settlement of Leontovichi is being recorded. The entire area, marked in red, has come under the control of Russian armed forces. It should be noted that previously, there were reports about Zverovo coming under Russian control. Today, an increase in the controlled zone toward Pokrovsk has also been recorded, with data about the actions of sabotage and reconnaissance groups in the southern outskirts of Pokrovsk. Reports are coming in that Novasilka has also come under Russian forces' control, and offensive operations are currently being conducted against Chunishino. This settlement is located in the indicated area. If the transition of Novasilka under Russian control is confirmed, it is quite likely that by the end of the week, this settlement will also be under Russian forces' control. It should be noted that this information requires verification. Upon receiving video evidence confirming the expansion of controlled territory and the transition of Novasilka under Russian armed forces' control, corresponding corrections will be made to the map. The only confirmed changes in the South Pokrovsk sector today concern the Leontovichi area. The entire territory marked in red has come under Russian control. Now let's move to further changes on the map. In the Mugrad area, reports are coming in that Russian units are conducting combat operations for the industrial zone. In the northeastern part of Mugrad, intensive attacks are being carried out on Ukrainian armed forces fortifications. Regarding the settlement of Kran Leman, here Russian formations, according to individual sources, have already established control on the eastern outskirts. However, today confirming materials were received only from this section of military operations. All this territory marked in red has indeed come under Russian control. However, pro-Russian sources claim the consolidation of Russians on the eastern outskirts. There are also reports of Russian forces approaching the settlement of Rodinskoye. It is located in the indicated place, and Russian positions are approximately in this area. So far, materials verifying this expansion of the controlled zone have not been received. Upon receiving video confirmations, changes will be made. In addition, Russian forces are straightening the salient in the Fedorivka area, south of it. All this territory has also been cleared and came under Russian forces' control. Regarding the settlement of Suvarovo, which is located in the indicated place, reports are coming in about Russian forces entering this settlement. Individual sources are ahead of events, claiming the transition of this settlement under Russian armed forces' control. However, confirming data has not been received yet. The only verified information came from the area of the settlement of Boykivka. It is located in the indicated place, and the entire territory west of the settlement of Boykivka came under Russian army control. In this area, the advance was up to 2 kilometers toward the settlement of Nikonarivka, which is located here. Confirming materials about the capture of Novotoretsk have also been received. I remind you that we have been reporting for several days about the transition of Novotoretsk under Russian control, and only today materials arrived verifying the capture of part of this settlement. It should be noted that there is still a street of this settlement here, but most likely it is already under Russian army control, and Russian forces are increasing the controlled zone west of the settlement of Chasova Yar. Yesterday, or rather the day before yesterday, we discussed this section of combat operations, which came under Russian control, and the indicated territory, this salient, was also cleared. And today 2 video materials arrived at once, one from a Ukrainian armed forces strongpoint located in the indicated place, and also one from this point. Here, Russian forces advanced 2.5 kilometers, and the entire territory marked in red today came under full Russian armed forces control, and everything indicates that Russian forces have already approached the settlement of Vladimirivka, and perhaps assault operations of this settlement have already begun. I would like to note that FAB 500s were repeatedly used in the Shakov area and in the indicated area, and all this indicates that after the use of FAB 500s, Russian forces proceed to assault operations of settlements, and everything is directed toward the fact that Russian forces will most likely capture Shakov and Vladimirivka under their control and then advance in the indicated direction toward the supply road. And if Russian forces have indeed reached Rodinskoye and capture it under their control, the main supply road to Pokrovsk passes here, and possibly the armed forces of the Russian Federation will force the Ukrainian armed forces to leave Pokrovsk and Mugrad to avoid significant destruction in these settlements. We continue to monitor the situation on this section of combat operations and move on. We move to the Costantineka direction. Reports are coming in that Yablonovka has already come under Russian army control. Alexander Kalinove has also come under Russian control. However, Ukrainian sources deny the loss of these 2 settlements, despite the arrival of several video materials from the Russian side from the indicated points. Previously, video materials demonstrating the location of advanced Russian positions were received, and we can observe that all these settlements, Alexander Kalinova and Yablonovka, are actually under Russian armed forces control, and the supply road to Katarinivka and Kleban-Baik has already been cut, and individual sources report that Russian forces are already moving toward the supply road, which runs in the indicated manner to Kleban-Baik, Katarinivka and Sherbinivka, and are seeking to cut off the Ukrainian armed forces grouping from supply. However, this information also requires additional verification, since Russian forces have repeatedly approached even Pleshchevka. Positional battles were fought at this point, where advanced Russian positions were located. Advanced positions of the Russian army were also located at this crossroads, but the Ukrainian armed forces managed to push back the Russians and knock them out of these points. And now information is coming in that requires additional verification. Upon receiving confirmations, changes will be made to the map. But for today, here is such news. Let's move to the settlement of Chasova Yar. There are significant changes on the map here. From the indicated points, from 3 points at once, video materials demonstrating advanced positions of Russian forces have been received. Here the advance was up to 500 minianas in favor of the armed forces of the Russian Federation, and the entire territory marked in red came under Russian armed forces control. And the Ukrainian side reports that attacks are being conducted here on Russian forces' positions. Counterattacks are also taking place in the area of the settlement of Stupochki, but today the changes are in favor of the Russian army. Let's move to the Seusk direction. The situation here is quite controversial. Pro-Russian sources report that the Russians reached the indicated points and cleared this entire territory. From these points, video materials came from the Ukrainian side, where Russian armed forces' armored vehicles were destroyed, and Russian forces were forced to retreat both in Serebryanka and in the Verkhnokamianska area. I remind you that Serebryanka, Grigorovka, according to individual data, officially came under Russian forces' control. Even from Serebryanka, video materials were received, but some pro-Russian sources even deny this information, claiming that Serebryanka and Grigorovka came under Russian control only on paper. Also, regarding Verkhnekamianska, it is reported that the Ukrainian armed forces are still present on the northern outskirts of Verkhnekamianska, and despite receiving video materials, this territory is under Ukrainian armed forces control. From here, we also expect additional video materials to make corrections to the map. Today, here are such changes. I remind you that this information came several days ago, 2 days ago, that Russian forces here passed in a column towards Seusk, but achieved no success. Regarding the Serebryanka forest, here is also a controversial situation, a very contradictory situation. Ukrainian sources report that groups of Russian sabotage and reconnaissance groups were destroyed here, but Russian sources report that they managed to take this forest area under Russian armed forces control and advance 3 kilometers. We are awaiting additional video materials. Upon the appearance of video materials about further advancement of Russian forces, this territory will indeed be under full Russian control. If information appears from Ukrainian sources that Ukrainian military are present at any of these strongpoints, then we will make corrections to the map and color them in favor of the Ukrainian army. Therefore, here today is such a situation that requires additional verification. Let's move to the Kran Leman direction. There are changes here on several sections of combat operations at once. Let's start with the settlement of Kolodyazy. According to individual data, Russian forces nevertheless managed to enter the settlement of Kolodyazy. The advance was up to 700 miles. From this point came video material where Russian forces established positions on the northern outskirts, and the entire territory marked in red came under Russian armed forces control. I remind you that previously, Russian forces occupied key heights north of Kolodyazy, and for a long time counterattacks were conducted here by the Ukrainian armed forces, not allowing the Russians to advance. Also previously information was received that Russian forces captured Mern under their control, but this information was spread in pro-Russian sources. The Ukrainian side reported that Mern is under Ukrainian armed forces control, and indeed Mern was under Ukrainian armed forces control for a long time, and possibly is still under Ukrainian armed forces control now, because if the Russians had managed to capture Mern under their control, then from Yampolivka it would be possible to supply the grouping of Russian forces and proceed to an offensive on Kolodyazy from the southern outskirts, thereby squeezing this settlement from two sides. And today, data is coming in that Russian forces nevertheless managed to enter the northern outskirts. Let's move to Zelena Dolina. Here, Russian forces expanded the controlled zone up to 2 kilometers west of this settlement, and the entire territory marked in red came under Russian forces control. Also from this point came today another video material confirming the expansion of the controlled zone in favor of the Russians. And confirming materials also came in, which we spoke about earlier. Previously, we discussed that Russian forces are expanding the controlled zone north of the settlement of Redkudub, and today changes came on this section of combat operations. All this territory came under Russian armed forces control, and attacks are still being conducted on the settlement of Novi Mir and Glushchenkova. Glushchenkov is located here is Novi Mir, and combat operations are also being conducted north of the settlement of Grekovka. Otherwise, today here are such changes. Let's move further to the Kupansk direction. No significant changes have been recorded here today. I remind you that previously Russian forces advanced north of Kupansk. According to individual data, it is reported that Russian forces are expanding the controlled zone and bypassing Kupansk, but this information also requires additional verification, since information repeatedly came that Russian forces captured Kondrashivka under their control, captured Mala Shapkivka under their control, but this information did not correspond to reality. And only a month later, Kondrashivka came under Russian control, and Mala Shapkivka is still under Ukrainian armed forces control. Therefore, here we apply changes to the map with some delay. Upon receiving materials, we will make changes to the map. Also, positional combat operations continue in the area of the settlement of Kamianka, without any significant changes on the map. Vovchansk is quiet today. This section of combat operations, this territory that came under Russian army control several days ago, and today positional combat operations are being conducted here, No significant advances in favor of the Russian or Ukrainian army have been recorded. The same applies to the Lipsy district. There are no significant changes here today. And there are no changes on the Sumy direction, but there is news from there. News is coming from the settlement of Kondratovka and Andreevka. I remind you that previously Russian forces controlled Kondratovka and Andreevka, after which the Ukrainian armed forces counterattacked and knocked the Russians out of these settlements. And today information also came that Ukrainian military are preparing attacks not only on Costantineka, which is located here, but also on Alexeyevka. Previously, after the capture of Kondratovka and Andreevka under Ukrainian armed forces control, Ukrainian military tried to attack Alexeyevka, but failed to knock out the Russians, and now accumulation of Ukrainian armed forces reserves is taking place in order to further conduct assault operations on Alexeyevka, as well as on the settlement of Costantineka. This information comes in the form of news and requires additional verification. In the next 1 to 2 weeks, we will see here whether the Ukrainian armed forces will attack these settlements, whether they will storm them. And regarding the settlement of Yunakivka and Sadki, fierce combat operations continue here along the entire line of contact. I remind you that Russian forces established positions in forest areas east of the settlement of Sadki and also blocked Ukrainian armed forces servicemen in Yunakivka. And today no significant changes on the map are recorded here. Today we have such news. Thank you all for watching. Until we meet again.